Alright, so the introduction part of muscles, we're going to be looking at physiology, how things work, some general characteristics. So all movements, any movement that you make requires typically more than one muscle. So when I lift my arm, I'm primarily using my biceps, but there are other muscles that are involved with it. So they use chemical energy. We'll talk about ATP, creatine. Some people actually take creatine supplements. We'll talk about that a little bit. Provide muscle tone. Some people naturally have more muscle tone than others. It moves body fluids, it moves your food, it helps your heartbeat, and it generates heat, which is why you get hot when you exercise. So three main types of muscles are skeletal, and that's the ones that are going to move your skeleton. These are the main ones that you probably think of: biceps, triceps, quadriceps. Smooth muscle deals with organs, so your stomach and how that propels food and things like that. And cardiac then will deal specifically with heart muscle and how that works. Okay. Can you do me a favor? Are you stopping at the office?
Yeah, okay.
Copy down what I have for Clayton. It's pretty much 8.2 lecture notes.
Okay.
There you go.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So structure, when we actually talk about the muscular system, each individual muscle is considered an organ of the muscular system. It has muscular tissue, nervous tissue, blood flow that is needed for your muscles to contract, and then connective tissue that we'll talk about. So connective tissue, there's layers of dense connective tissue called fascia that surrounds and separates each muscle. It also connects your skin to muscle. So when we dissect cats and you skin the cats, it's like this little white fibers that you're going to cut through. And they also surround and separate each muscle. So if you have like a raw steak, you can almost see that lining in that surrounds the little parts of it. This connective tissue also extends. It gives rise to tendons. So this fascia is going to be part that's going to extend into a tendon, and they're also fused to the outside of bones. So it also helps to connect your muscle to bones. Tendon connects a muscle to a bone. A ligament is bone to bone. Tendon is muscle to bone. Sometimes muscles are connected to each other. So from one muscle to another muscle, and that's called an aponeurosis. The top of your head has one, your abdomen has a large one. So aponeurosis connects one muscle directly to another muscle. Layer of connective tissue, this is going to be similar to when we talked about bone. Epimysium surrounds each whole muscle, so that's like the outside. Perimysium surrounds individual muscles, and we'll look at a picture that will make more sense. And then each individual fiber in the muscular system, a muscle cell is a muscle fiber, and each one of them has a layer of lining around it, and that's endomysium. So endo inside, that's going to be the furthest one inside of the muscle. So here's the big picture. I'm going to pretend that this is my biceps muscle right here. So this is the whole thing. It has muscular fascia on the outside. It extends to help make the tendon. It covers the bone. Inside of that, epimysium is this outside lining. And then you have bundles inside of here, and the perimysium is what surrounds those bundles. So as I look at this, out comes what's actually called a fascicle, which is a smaller part of the muscle. You can see nerve, blood vessels. And then a muscle fiber is just one of these little parts right here. So this would be considered a muscle cell. And inside of that muscle cell, I'm going to have myofibrils and filaments, and we'll talk more about that later. But the endomysium is what's going to cover each individual muscle fiber. So endomysium inside, paramysium next, and then epimysium surrounds the whole thing. And those filaments and myofibrils are how your muscle actually contracts. So a muscle fiber is a muscle cell. They're just called fibers because they're long, skinny cells. They're not round and shaped like most cells are. They're long, they're shaped like a cylinder. They also have special names. So when we study cells in biology, we talk about the cell membrane. In a muscle cell or a muscle fiber, the cell membrane is called the sarcolemma. So that's the outside membrane of your cell. And then sarcoplasm is the cytoplasm. And your muscles are full of mitochondria, because what's the job of mitochondria?
Creates energy.
Creates energy. And in order for my muscles to work, they need a huge supply of energy. And the mitochondria is what supplies that. So, sarcoplasm, the cytoplasm inside, contains those myofibrils that were in the diagram a couple slides back. Thick filaments are made up of myosin. Thin filaments are made up of actin, for the most part. I want you to know those two for sure. Along with troponin and tropomyosin are also part of your thin filaments. And the organization of those is what causes the striations in your muscle cells when we look under the microscope. And the movement of these filaments is what also is going to cause your muscle to contract. So, myofibrils have many sarcomeres, which are basically blocks that go along. A sarcomere is going to start with a Z-line. So if you have your notes in front of you, you can see the diagram at the same time as I'm talking about this. A sarcomere goes from one Z-line to the next Z-line. So that's the band or the block that is a sarcomere. I-bands are light in color. They're made up of actin, so thin filaments, and they're anchored to or connected to Z-lines, which are very dark lines. A-bands are going to be darker in color, and they're made up of both the thick and thin filaments where they come together. And then in the center of the A-band is an H-zone, and that's where your myosin is located. That's where your thick filaments are going to be located. The M-line is in the center of the H-zone, and proteins that hold the myosin filaments are located there. So when we get to the picture, I'll kind of show you what I expect. So here's the picture. A sarcomere goes from one Z-line to another Z-line. And as I'm looking up here, myosin is going to be purple, actin is going to be blue. So if I look down here, my A-band is going to be more of my thick filaments of purple. My I is going to be more of my thin filaments. And the bands and the zones I'm not as concerned with. But what happens when these muscles contract is those bands are going to get closer together. When I contract my muscle squeezes, things get closer together. When it relaxes, those are going to move further apart. And here's just another diagram. This would actually be under a microscope. So here's those Z lines that show up very well. So that would be a sarcomere. Here I would have my thick filaments. Here I would have my thin filaments. And then as they move, they're going to move closer to or affect that Z line. Endoplasmic reticulum, another biology term. In muscle, it's the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So anytime you see sarco, it's going to deal with muscles. Sarcoplasm, sarcoplasmic reticulum. Transverse or T-tubules are located inside of your sarcolemma. And this part, probably not as important. Each T-tubule lies between two cisternae of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and then it opens to the outside of the muscle fiber. This will be important in how they contract. Both of these activate your muscle contraction when the fiber is stimulated. And we'll talk about an all or none response. So basically what I want you to know is the function of these is to activate muscle contraction. Diagram here, you can see there's tons of mitochondria. They provide energy. Remember, purple is thick, blue is thin. Anything else that that's probably the most important part on that diagram. So a junction between neuromuscular, nervous system, muscular, that's going to be a neuromuscular junction. Each muscle fiber is functionally connected to an axon or part of your nervous system. So every single muscle fiber is connected to a nerve. So each fiber is stimulated separately. That'll become very important. The neuron communicates with the muscle fiber by way of neurotransmitters, some type of chemical that's going to come across the membrane and be released into the muscle. Motor neuron and muscle fiber meet. That's what we just talked about. The muscle fiber forms a motor end plate. That's just the term given to that area. And where the sarcolemma is tightly folded, nuclei and mitochondria are abundant, so kind of towards the outside. Cytoplasm of the motor neuron contains synaptic vesicles, mitochondria, and those are what store the neurotransmitters that tell your muscles when they are to contract. When an electrical impulse from your nervous system reaches the motor neuron, those vesicles release those transmitters, and those transmitters are going to stimulate your muscle fiber to contract. And here, acetylcholine is a very common neurotransmitter for the muscular system. That's one of the most common. When acetylcholine is released, it's going to tell your muscle to contract. And you can see where this motor end plate is at on the outside. Here's your thick and thin filaments. Notice that it's pretty much on the outside of those is where they're released. And what happens is every fiber is stimulated individually. So if I pick up my pen, how many fibers do I need? Not all that many. It's pretty light. It's not that hard to do. So when I'm lifting up a pen, I have a few muscle fibers that are stimulated. If I go to lift a desk that I can't even lift, how many muscle fibers are going to be stimulated? All of them. So a fiber, you don't use the same amount of muscle every time you contract. And that's where I'll stop with that section.